Hello, this is a very quick tutorial looking at some data from a student practical where the students were breathing different concentrations of oxygen and they were looking at spirometry and end-tidal gases. You can see on the screen here we have 4 channels of recorded data, the first being peripheral oxygen saturation, or SaO2 or SpO2 it should be. Underneath here we've got flow taken from a spirometry pod, and the bottom 2 channels are oxygen and carbon dioxide measured continuously, taken from the mouthpiece. So from these we can determine the end tidals. I'm not going to dwell on the flow measurements or the oxygen saturation measurements, so I'm just going to move them out of the way and just highlight really what we're interested in, which is the oxygen and carbon dioxide concentrations, which are measured here in percentages. You'll all probably remember that the end tidal oxygen is the minimum of this tidal curve here down the bottom, and the end tidal carbon dioxide concentration is the peak taken from the carbon dioxide curves. So if you want to derive from this a running total of oxygen and CO2 end tidals, we just need to set up 2 derived channels, one from the oxygen that takes the minimum peaks and one from the carbon dioxide that takes the maximum peaks, and then just make sure that the 2 correlate with the data we see on the screen. So to do this, I go to the setup, go to channel settings and add 2 more channels, one of which I'm going to call EtO2 and the other I'm going to call EtCO2, and then press OK. So we can now see there are 2 extra channels on the bottom, and I can then use the cyclic variable setting to determine what it is I want to measure from these. So the first one, O2, as I said before, we need to choose the negative trough or the negative peak deflection, which gives us the end tidals. So we choose the drop-down box and choose cyclic measurements, and from this we choose the channel, oxygen, we choose a measurement which is minimum, and then we choose the preset which is airflow. It should then find the peaks, and then beyond the peak it'll follow the data down until it finds a trough, make a note of that number and report it on the derived channel. I'm just going to scan through and make sure, yep, all the data look pretty good. Press OK, and here is our end tidal oxygen. We'll come back and check that in a second. So now we look at the CO2, choose a drop-down list, cyclic measurements. We then choose the CO2 channel, or carbon dio as it's called on this screen. We then want to choose the maximum, that's the end tidal, and then we need to choose the preset, airflow. These presets are actually quite useful. They do just give you a good starting point to be able to then tweak data. Have a look at those data, they look pretty good. Make sure that my peak detection adjustment is set up correctly, and then press OK. Now let's just check whether these data look as we expect them to look based on the data we see on the screen. That's always a vital thing to do with these kind of data. Don't just trust a wiggly line created by some software. Invariably it may get it wrong, and that'll kind of ruin your day. So let's just zoom out a little bit and have a look at the data, rescale all those channels automatically so we can see what's going on. And you can see it seems to have tracked it incredibly well. Where we look over on this curve here, where the student seems to be breathing some hypercapnic gas, which is 5% CO2, we can immediately see that the end tidal O2 is creeping up, and we see that on this graph. It then plateaus off a little bit and hangs around. The end tidal CO2 creeps up to about 6%, and we can see that on the peaks of these lines. There's a little glitch there where probably the student coughed or did something, but you can ignore those data. And then it travels across and tracks across, and you can see that. So now we've got 2 graphs showing the end tidal oxygen and end tidal CO2, which you can then use the data pad to collect data from, either bin it, choose plateaus, or choose changes over time.